Lee Van Cleef was Hollywood's most feared villain, and he utterly despised John Wayne.
You don't have to give us 2 weeks' notice. I fire you right now. That was that. I closed up the book, never went back.
But this wasn't just a rivalry. It was a war of politics, power, and personal betrayal. Why did he hate America's biggest movie icon? Today we uncover the truth behind the feud Hollywood tried to forget. You wouldn't know it from the posters, but Hollywood's greatest villain was never supposed to make it this far. Lee Van Cleef didn't look like your average leading man. In fact, he didn't look like much of anything Hollywood knew what to do with in the 1950s. He had a hawk-like nose, angular cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, and eyes that could freeze a man in place. He spoke little, but his stare said enough. The kind of guy who could kill you in a saloon without standing up from his chair. But behind that stone-cold look was a story no studio could script. Born in the small, working-class town of Somerville, New Jersey, in 1925, Lee's early life was built on discipline. His father was a watchmaker, a job that required microscopic precision and patience. That mindset rubbed off. Lee spent hours as a boy quietly fixing broken things. Clocks, toys, anything mechanical. He was methodical, serious, the kind of kid who didn't smile unless he meant it. Then World War II hit. At just 17, Van Cleef enlisted in the U.S. Navy and became a sonar man on a minesweeper. He wasn't a glory hunter. He didn't fire the big guns. He listened, monitored, and every time a blip appeared on the sonar, it could mean a mine. A life or death moment, delivered in silence. This wasn't a man who needed to shout to be powerful. But war left its mark. By the time he came home, Van Cleef had developed a quiet intensity, something unshakable. He tried to study engineering at the University of South Carolina, but college felt distant, fake even. Acting, strangely enough, felt more honest. So he packed up and headed west. Hollywood had no idea what to do with him at first. Too intense for the hero, too strange for the sidekick. So what did they do? They cast him as the villain, over and over again. In 1952, he appeared in High Noon, playing a henchman with barely any lines. But even in silence, he stole scenes. Something about him just worked. His eyes like razor wire. His stillness, scarier than a gun. He was the guy behind the guy, the one who showed up just before the bullets started flying. And Hollywood noticed. But it wasn't all glamour. His roles were often uncredited, forgettable parts in forgettable shows. The man who would one day redefine the anti-hero was for a time nothing more than the guy with the sharp face. And just when things were starting to look up, disaster struck. A brutal car accident shattered his leg and left doctors wondering if he'd ever walk without a limp again. The damage was severe, so much so that Van Cleef was told he'd never ride a horse again. In other words, his Western career, over. Hollywood shrugged. It moved on, as it always does, but Van Cleef didn't. He recovered, slowly, painfully, with a steel rod in his leg and a growing bitterness in his chest. It wasn't just about the injury. It was about how easily the industry discarded him. The very people who had once called him perfect for the part no longer returned his calls. But he refused to disappear. He grew the mustache, hardened the stare, made himself impossible to ignore. And just when it seemed like he might fade into the long list of Hollywood almost, a phone rang. It was from Italy. A director named Sergio Leone had just made a hit with Clint Eastwood, and he wanted a new villain. Not just any villain, a ghost in black, a man of few words, with eyes like gun barrels. That man was Lee Van Cleef. But the moment he got on that plane to Rome, he wasn't just chasing a comeback. He was chasing a legacy. And on the other side of the world, another man was already sitting on a throne, a Hollywood cowboy named John Wayne. Two men, one genre, but only one would play by the rules. And Van Cleef was never one for rules. He didn't wear a crown, but in Hollywood he didn't need to. John Wayne was the king of the Western, a walking, talking embodiment of the American myth. Tall, square-jawed, slow-talking, and always on the side of good. When he stepped onto the screen, it wasn't just an entrance, it was a statement. He didn't play a character, he played John Wayne, over and over again. But behind the curtain of movie magic, There was something that rubbed people the wrong way, something that actors like Lee Van Cleef couldn't ignore. To understand why Van Cleef hated John Wayne, we first have to understand who John Wayne really was. Born Marion Morrison in 1907, Wayne didn't start out a cowboy. He was a failed football player who stumbled into the movie business as a prop boy. It was only when director Raoul Walsh spotted his hulking frame and intense glare that he was cast in a low-budget Western and given a new name, John Wayne. That name would go on to shape the image of American masculinity for decades. He became the hero who always did the right thing, the sheriff who stood tall while the town cowered, the father figure, the patriot, the man who never flinched, and people loved him for it. He starred in over 150 films, won an Oscar, and even had Navy ships named after him. He wasn't just an actor, he was a national icon. But for many in Hollywood, especially serious actors like Lee Van Cleef, Wayne wasn't a legend. He was a myth, a walking commercial for America's ego. Van Cleef, who had spent years bleeding for scraps, who took roles where every emotion had to be carved into his face like stone, saw something in Wayne that drove him insane. He didn't evolve, he didn't stretch, he didn't act, he just showed up. Wayne didn't do vulnerability, he didn't do ambiguity. His heroes never questioned the rules. They were the rules. And that's where the real rift began. To Van Cleef, film was about transformation, becoming something else, even something dark. But Wayne, he was always the same, clean-cut, righteous, and firmly planted in a version of America that never truly existed. The clash wasn't just personal, it was philosophical. And the deeper you go, the more twisted it gets. Because as John Wayne's fame grew, so did his influence. He wasn't just picking scripts, he was shaping the narratives of American history. Films like The Green Berets weren't just entertainment, they were propaganda. Wayne was a proud conservative, a vocal supporter of the Vietnam War, and a man who once told Playboy magazine in 1971, quote, "I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility." That quote didn't age well. Even then, it caused a backlash. But Van Cleef had been ahead of the curve. He had always distrusted Wayne's brand of old-school patriotism, the way he carried himself like America's moral compass, even as he refused to serve in World War II, instead choosing to stay in Hollywood and make war movies. That hypocrisy, it didn't sit well with Van Cleef, who had served. While Van Cleef was scraping barnacles off naval mines in the Pacific, Wayne was filming Flying Tigers, a movie about a war he never fought in. To some, that made Wayne a smart businessman. To Van Cleef, it made him a fraud. And it wasn't just about the war or the politics. It was about the pedestal, the untouchable image that Wayne projected. The idea that one man could define what it meant to be a hero, while others were told they'd never be more than background noise. To Van Cleef, who was battling typecasting, physical injury, and a broken career, Wayne represented everything fake about Hollywood, everything easy. But Van Cleef didn't want easy, he wanted revenge. And that moment was coming. They both wore cowboy hats, they both carried guns. But that's where the similarities ended. By the mid-1960s, John Wayne was a full-blown Hollywood deity. At that point, he'd been playing the same character, the noble American cowboy, for over 3 decades. And it was still working. His movies were flag-waving epics. He spoke in slow, commanding drawls. He got the girl, he won the fight, and if a Native American or Mexican happened to die along the way, well, it was just part of the story. That's how sanitized Wayne's version of the West was. Clean, romantic, glorified. But far away from Hollywood's backlots, in a dusty part of Spain, a revolution was quietly brewing, and Lee Van Cleef was at the center of it. This was the rise of the spaghetti western. Gritty, violent, morally ambiguous films made mostly by Italian directors with shoestring budgets and a deep skepticism of American mythology. Sergio Leone, the godfather of the genre, was on a mission to strip the Western of its hero worship. He didn't want clean, he wanted real, flawed, dirty, human. And that's exactly why he called Van Cleef. After a decade of being ignored, after a car crash that nearly ended his career, Van Cleef was about to step into a role that would redefine the entire genre. Colonel Douglas Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More. Unlike Wayne's characters, Mortimer wasn't a squeaky clean hero. He was cold, calculating, but also deeply tragic. His actions were brutal but motivated by justice. There were layers, and Van Cleef played every one of them with a quiet, burning precision. When that film hit, everything changed. Van Cleef wasn't just the guy behind the guy anymore. He was the guy. And it got even better in 1966 when Leone cast him again in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Arguably the most iconic Western ever made. Clint Eastwood was the star, but Van Cleef as Angel Eyes, the relentless bounty hunter with eyes like sharpened steel, stole the show. Suddenly, he was a global phenomenon. But here's the twist. Despite his newfound fame, Lee Van Cleef was still considered an outsider by Hollywood. Why? Because his success came from Europe, not America. His brand of Western was considered too violent, too cynical, too real. It challenged the myth that Wayne had spent decades carefully crafting, where Wayne's cowboys wore white hats and rode for justice. Van Cleef's cowboys wore dust and blood and rode for something far more complicated: revenge, redemption, or sometimes just survival. And most importantly, Wayne was adored. Van Cleef was feared. But here's the irony. In 1966, as Van Cleef's European fame exploded, Hollywood still wouldn't touch him. Studios hesitated to cast him in major productions. He was too intense, too foreign, too much of a wild card. Meanwhile, John Wayne, pushing 60, was still playing the same roles, still winning, still walking into saloons like he owned the place. To many actors, Wayne was an inspiration. To Van Cleef, he was a roadblock, a symbol of a system that had written him off, and still couldn't see the brilliance in what he had become. And the more Van Cleef succeeded overseas, the more the divide grew. Two stars, two audiences, two completely different versions of what a Western should be. But Hollywood is a small town with a long memory, and soon the tensions between these two titans wouldn't just stay in interviews or casting decisions. They would start to bleed into personal attacks, rumors, resentments, because Van Cleef didn't just dislike Wayne's roles. He hated what he stood for, and what came next would cement that hatred forever. Every gunslinger has a turning point. For Lee Van Cleef, it came not with a bang, but with a phone call from Italy. It's 1965. Van Cleef is broke, washed up, living in LA and barely getting by doing odd jobs and tiny roles in television. If he was lucky, directors remembered him as the guy who always played the silent henchman. Reliable, sure, but forgettable. A man with one face, one function. And yet across the Atlantic, director Sergio Leone is preparing his next Western, For a Few Dollars More, the sequel to A Fistful of Dollars. He needs a second lead. Not just any actor, someone who looks like he's been through hell. Someone with presence, gravitas, danger. He sees a photo of Van Cleef, and just like that, Leone makes the call that would change everything. Van Cleef hadn't even been on a horse in years. His leg injury from the car accident still gave him trouble. He hadn't carried a lead role in a single Hollywood film. But Leone didn't care. He flew him out to Rome. And what happened next? Van Cleef became the Western. His character, Colonel Douglas Mortimer, was a revelation, a former soldier turned bounty hunter, driven by vengeance and shaped by loss. The way Van Cleef carried himself, quiet, composed, deadly, was a masterclass in restraint. Where American Westerns were still showing cowboys with shining badges and clean morals, Leone's Westerns were asking harder questions. What if the good guy isn't good? What if the villain has a reason? What if the line between justice and revenge doesn't exist? Van Cleef delivered all of that, without ever raising his voice. The film was a smash hit across Europe, and then came The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. If the first film was a breakthrough, this was a bullet to the heart of the old Western genre. Van Cleef played Angel Eyes, a bounty hunter so cold and calculated, he made other villains look like cartoon characters. Every gesture was deliberate. Every line was laced with menace. He didn't chew the scenery, he owned it. Even next to Clint Eastwood, now a massive star, Van Cleef stood tall. Taller, in fact, his presence was magnetic. Fans in Europe loved him. In places like Spain, Italy, and Germany, he was a bigger draw than Wayne himself. Back in the US, critics started to pay attention. They couldn't believe it. The same guy who used to be the silent thug in the background was now carrying international blockbusters, playing complex, commanding roles, and doing it better than most American stars, including John Wayne. But as Van Cleef's star rose overseas, the animosity between him and Wayne started heating up, quietly, bitterly, never in the press, always behind closed doors, because this wasn't just a rivalry of actors, it was a clash of eras. John Wayne was the past, the clean-cut sheriff, the righteous man's man, the embodiment of American values. Van Cleef was the future, morally gray, emotionally wounded, and more human than a hero. Hollywood began to feel that shift. And John Wayne? He hated it. Rumors began to swirl that Wayne had personally blocked Van Cleef from certain studio-backed films, that he vetoed working with him, that he refused to share the screen with an actor he considered too dark, too intense. But Van Cleef wasn't interested in playing by the Duke's rules. He'd already found something better: creative freedom. In Europe, he had final say on scripts. He played anti-heroes, mentors, vigilantes, characters with depth, characters with scars. And best of all, he got respect. For once, he wasn't the backup villain. He was the story, and yet the bitterness never faded. Every time he saw Wayne in another blockbuster back home, with his clean image and same old performance, it reminded Van Cleef that America had never wanted him. Until he became a legend somewhere else. But even legends carry wounds. And Van Cleef's hatred wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. And in the next chapter, we find out exactly why. He didn't just dislike John Wayne, he despised him. And it wasn't about ego, it was about everything Wayne stood for. By the late 1960s, Lee Van Cleef was finally a star, but he wasn't basking in Hollywood limelight. Instead, he was holed up in Rome hotel rooms, knocking out one gritty spaghetti western after another, each role steeped in pain, silence, and complexity. He was the thinking man's gunslinger, the haunted mentor, the man who walked the line between law and lawlessness. Meanwhile, across the ocean, John Wayne was still churning out blockbuster after blockbuster, playing the same red-blooded, God-fearing cowboy he always had. And that was exactly the problem. To Van Cleef, it was like watching a man wear the same mask in every room and getting applauded for it. Wayne didn't play characters. He played a concept: American exceptionalism. And Van Cleef? He found it nauseating. But the deeper root of his hatred ran even colder, into something far more divisive: politics. John Wayne was more than an actor. He was an ideologue, one of the most vocal conservatives in all of Hollywood, a staunch supporter of the Vietnam War, a founding member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, a group that actively supported the blacklisting of alleged communists in the film industry. In other words, if you didn't align with Wayne's version of America, you didn't belong in it. Van Cleef, on the other hand, didn't wear his politics on his sleeve. But those who knew him say he leaned fiercely toward individual liberty, anti-establishment views, and deeply distrusted Hollywood's power structure, especially when it was manipulated by men like Wayne. He saw Wayne as a mouthpiece, a propaganda machine wrapped in a cowboy hat. And the final nail? Wayne had dodged the draft in World War II, while Lee Van Cleef was in uniform, risking his life sweeping naval mines in enemy waters. Wayne stayed home, acting in war films, pretending to be a hero. That hypocrisy made Van Cleef's blood boil. In Hollywood circles, Van Cleef was famously hard to rattle. On set, he was quiet, professional, almost cold. But if John Wayne's name came up, the mask cracked. It was said that Van Cleef once stormed out of a meeting when a producer suggested pairing them in a two-hander western. Another time, when a fan on set called him the evil John Wayne, Van Cleef snapped, "I'd rather be the villain than a cardboard saint." To him, Wayne's brand of masculinity, the square-jawed, unfeeling, might is right cowboy, wasn't just outdated, it was dangerous. Van Cleef believed in earning your character, in showing weakness, doubt, conflict. Wayne believed in hiding it, and the idea that such a man could become America's hero. That stuck in Van Cleef's throat like a bullet. But it wasn't just ideological. There were real career consequences too. Wayne had enormous pull in the industry. He produced films, had friends in studio boardrooms, and behind the scenes there were whispers that he actively shut Van Cleef out of certain productions. At the time, Van Cleef was riding high off the Big Gun Down and Death Rides a Horse. Studios were finally waking up to his star power. But when a Western epic being planned by a major American studio considered him for the lead, Van Cleef mysteriously disappeared from the shortlist. Wayne had already signed on as executive producer. Coincidence? Maybe. But Van Cleef never forgot it, and he never forgave it. It became more than a feud. It became a principle. And maybe that's why Van Cleef's characters always felt realer. They limped, they mourned, they doubted. They were men you could believe in, even if they scared you. But hate comes at a cost. And Van Cleef's refusal to play the Hollywood game, especially Wayne's game, meant the doors he should have been walking through were quietly closing behind him. And as the Western genre began to fade, so too did the rivalry. But what happened next? That was something neither man could have predicted. Sometimes the most brutal shootouts in the West didn't happen with guns. They happened in casting rooms, with phone calls, whispers, and one powerful word: no. For all their similarities, their cowboy boots, their Western drawls, their hardened stares, Lee Van Cleef and John Wayne never made a single film together. Not once. And that wasn't an accident. It was a silent war, a cold one. Fought not with bullets, but with influence, pride, and professional sabotage. Behind the scenes in 1970s Hollywood, the John Wayne machine was still humming. Even as he aged and his box office appeal began to wane, Wayne held on to power like a sheriff clutching his last badge. His production company, Batjack, was still active. His connections at studios ran deep. Directors owed him favors. Casting decisions often went through him. And when it came to Van Cleef, Wayne made his position clear, off the record, of course. He didn't like him, didn't trust him, thought his characters were too dark, too foreign, too damn cynical. According to multiple Hollywood insiders, any project that brought up Lee Van Cleef's name around Wayne would find the air go cold. He didn't throw tantrums. He didn't need to. He'd simply say, "Not him," and that was that. But here's the kicker. For a brief moment, they almost worked together. In the early 1970s, Universal was developing a big-budget Western that would feature two aging gunslingers, one righteous, one morally ambiguous, teaming up for a final mission. It was supposed to be a genre-defining film, a sort of passing of the torch. The studio wanted Wayne for the lead, and for the other role, they pitched Lee Van Cleef. It was perfect casting, the aging outlaw with a shadowy past, forced to ride alongside the golden boy lawman. A contrast of philosophies, styles, even generations. The screen test script reportedly crackled with tension. But Wayne never let it get that far. He nixed the deal, privately told the studio the project wouldn't move forward with Van Cleef attached. The role was recast. The film eventually flopped, and a once-in-a-lifetime cinematic moment vanished. It's hard to say if Van Cleef ever knew the full extent of Wayne's behind-the-scenes influence, but he definitely knew something was wrong. In interviews, Van Cleef was always careful not to name names. He never publicly insulted Wayne, but his words were cold enough to frost glass. In one rare quote from the late 70s, he said, "There are actors who play the same man in every film. They say that's branding. I say it's laziness." No name mentioned, but everyone knew, and the message was clear. Lee Van Cleef didn't need John Wayne. He had carved his own path, across deserts, through violence, into cult legend. But it came at a cost. As the Western genre dried up in the 80s, Van Cleef's star dimmed. The roles stopped coming. Studios, still dominated by Wayne's era of thinking, didn't know what to do with men like him anymore. Complex cowboys weren't selling. People wanted superheroes now. And so Lee Van Cleef, the man who could say more with a stare than most could with a monologue, faded from the screen. Not defeated, just uninvited. As for John Wayne, he held on to his myth until the very end. Died in 1979, draped in the American flag, Not literally, but close enough. The Duke went out as a hero, a monument. But the truth, Hollywood had already started moving on. And in the years to come, film lovers would rediscover something they hadn't fully appreciated back then. Lee Van Cleef was doing something braver all along. Heroes are remembered, villains are remembered. But Lee Van Cleef, he became something rare, a myth that aged better than the legend. When Lee Van Cleef passed away in 1989, the obituaries were polite. Veteran Western actor, known for villain roles, starred opposite Clint Eastwood. But none of them captured what he actually was, because Lee Van Cleef wasn't just the villain, he was the mirror, the shadow cast by the shining hero, and in many ways the audience grew to love the shadow more. While John Wayne's brand of black and white masculinity began to feel outdated, stiff, sanitized, unrelatable, Van Cleef's characters started to resonate more than ever, especially with a new generation. Film students, indie directors, Tarantino types, they saw the nuance, the quiet, the pain behind the eyes. They watched the big gun down and death rides a horse and didn't just see a gunslinger. They saw a man, broken, brilliant, brutal, and undeniably human. Meanwhile, John Wayne's legacy grew complicated. His films, still classics. His image, still iconic. But the man, quotes, resurfaced. Controversial interviews, his political ties, his racial views, his draft avoidance during World War II all began to muddy the waters of his pristine myth. People started to ask, did we confuse fame with greatness? But Lee Van Cleef, his legend aged like whiskey in a gun barrel. He didn't pretend to be the good guy, didn't demand admiration, didn't push a political agenda or sell a version of America that never existed. He played killers with a conscience, lawmen with regrets, mentors with scars. And because of that, we believed him. He didn't wear a white hat. He didn't need to. Even today, his influence is everywhere. You see it in video games like Red Dead Redemption. You hear it in Ennio Morricone's haunting scores. You feel it every time a modern anti-hero stares down a villain in silence. Lee Van Cleef made the quiet, complicated cowboy cool before anyone else did. He never got the Oscar. He never got the parade. But he got something rare, immortality. Not in the halls of Hollywood, but in the hearts of those who know that real stories don't always have clear heroes. From Final Reflection. He was Hollywood's greatest cowboy, but one man hated him more than anyone. John Wayne, the legend, the icon, the American hero. Yet behind the scenes, another gunslinger, Lee Van Cleef, quietly burned with resentment. And now, we know why. One was the king of the Western, the other, its ghost. So what really happened between them? Was it jealousy or justice? Politics or principle? And in the end, who truly won? Lee Van Cleef never wore the white hat. He didn't play the hero. He didn't stand for tradition or for what the studio system wanted. But maybe that's exactly why he matters more now than ever. While John Wayne's myth has begun to rust under the weight of modern scrutiny, Van Cleef's image has only sharpened, like a knife in the dark. He didn't chase fame. He didn't ask for glory. He just became unforgettable. The villain who outlived the hero, not in life, but in meaning. And maybe that's the real twist to this story, because in the wild world of Westerns, sometimes the man you thought was the villain was the only one telling the truth. So tell me this, if they had faced off on screen, one final duel, who would have drawn first? And more importantly, who would you be rooting for? Lee Van Cleef never played the hero, but maybe he was one in his own way. As John Wayne's myth fades, Van Cleef's legacy only grows. So who really defined the Western? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and saddle up for the next story.